Peanut butter and? There you go. You comb your? Very good. 5 times 10 equals? We're in college. I hope we can get that one. Post-traumatic? Wrong. See, here's where I came to realize we have a great problem in our contemporary culture and society. We have this belief, this mindset that pain and fear, trauma, they have to result in these negative outcomes and consequences. And although I by no means want to prove that this is untrue or impossible, I want to acknowledge, better yet encourage the possibility for human beings to grow from their difficulties, their traumas, their inordinacies. I grew up what I consider to be a pretty average, normal childhood. I come from a small town in northern rural Minnesota. I had a happy family, mom, dad, younger sister, moderate house on the lake. What could be better, right? Well, little did I know how quickly my life was going to take a twist for the worst. This change happened so quick, yet so slowly. It felt as though it was an instant, yet it was an eternity. The importance, I urge you all to reciprocate in your own lives, though, is to take it on. Let it come and make the curse your blessing. Hi, my name is Logan Carlson, and I am Joel's son. Hi, my name is Logan Carlson, and I am Joni's son. Twice in high school, I stood at the lectern, speaking in front of hundreds of emotional onlookers. Those words there I spoke just a year apart. Those were the introductions to my final commemorations for my parents in their eulogies. The final time I saw my dad was 4 years ago, after my grandpa's funeral. As we walked out the doors of the church after my grandpa's memorial service, I turned and I gave my dad a hug goodbye as he went on his travels for work. That was the last time I'd see him. Just 1 week after my grandpa's funeral, I got a call while I was in school. Logan, your dad died from diabetes. It was sudden, shocking, certainly a trauma for everyone in my family. Just 1 year later, I spoke my final words to my mom in a hospital bed. After a hot summer soccer practice, as I walked off the field, I was told, Logan, your mom, she was rushed to the ER. This time, however, she wasn't going to be leaving. See, my mom's death, though, was not unexpected. She had battled cancer for 6 grueling years. Although still tragic, still a trauma, her death was not unforeseeable. Here I'd like to first address a very commonly held misconception. We have this idea that trauma has to be something sudden, quick, shocking. No. Trauma, too, can be a slow, ever-developing process within one's life. That, too, that is trauma. It's because of this misconception, then, that I so often fail to answer the question, well, Logan, whose death was harder for you to cope with, your mom's or your dad's? Yes, both. Both were, right? For each, I was left devastated. For each, I was sad. I was scared. For each, there was trauma, although derived from a different reason, sure. But as the saying goes, it's not about how hard you fall, but how you pick yourself back up. Well, in this case, it's not about the trauma nor how bad it hurt me, but how you approach your future. As we go here today, I want to just take a moment for you to think back on your own lives. Think of that difficulty, that trauma that you've had to overcome. My words here today, these are just examples, but I know each of you have had obstacles, have had those traumas that you've had to step over. Think of those as we go, and let us today grow together to become extraordinary. For me, there were two absolutely critical pieces of psychology that dominated my mindset, and these things, they ultimately allowed me to tackle the unimaginable. First is an idea of post-traumatic growth, not stress disorder, growth. The second is an idea of self-transcendence. I want to first touch on this topic of post-traumatic growth. It's a pretty recent development within the field of psychology. It's still being researched quite a bit, but to achieve post-traumatic growth, there's actually two criteria, two things that have to be met in order for one to achieve post-traumatic growth. The first of which is an idea of sense-making. Now, this is the coping process that society is pretty well familiar with. You have to accept and acknowledge the pain and the trauma that's gone on in your life, making sure not to deny its existence. The second criterion, though, of post-traumatic growth, that's what made me overwhelmingly aware that I could achieve post-traumatic growth. This is the idea of benefit finding. Now, benefit finding, much like the name suggests, is simply taking where you were in the past, and after this pain, after this trauma, you're trying to make yourself better in the future. Benefit finding doesn't have to be something physical or tangible, though it can be. Benefit finding, too, can be a change in the tenacity, the mindset with which you do things. That, too, is benefit finding. When you combine these two things, sense-making and benefit finding, then ultimately you have post-traumatic growth. I believe my first experiences and encounters with post-traumatic growth came shortly after my father passed away. You see, in his absence, there was this new motivation that absolutely fueled me, and this in action led me to dedicate every possible effort I could to my schoolwork with hopes that one day my sister and I might be financially stable. Now, although I can look back and conclude that I was slightly, if not completely insane, I applied to 52 different schools and universities my senior year. Not a good idea, right? But that said, I'm quite certain that if my parents were here today, if it weren't for the tough stuff in life, I never would have been able to pull that off. I wouldn't have had that mental grit, that mental endurance, to be able to write that many essays, to apply to that many schools. It simply wouldn't have happened. And so looking back, when I conclude on this, I'm quite certain that it's my parents' destiny that ultimately drove me to these new outcomes. And that's what's important here. You begin to apply that, you see a wide variety of things that expand for you in life. There's a great study that I believe portrays this idea quite well. A man named Daniel Kahneman, great author if you ever get the chance, and his associates, what they did is they conducted a research experiment. In this experiment, they had a temperature-controlled bucket of water. So picture a bucket of water here on stage. I'm going to reference it a couple times. Now they had participants roll up their sleeves and place their hand in this bucket of water. And because it was temperature-controlled, they could keep it painfully, extremely cold for some participants, and not so bad, or room temperature for others. Now, the interesting part of their findings was that participants actually preferred the coldest of all cold waters on one contingency. That contingency was, at the very last moment, when researchers told them they could remove their hand from this water, the researchers warmed up the water just a little bit, just a tad. Now, when we take this and we apply it to our idea of post-traumatic growth, I believe we see the same things. I believe people prefer more pain, more trauma, so long as at the last moment they're able to relieve themselves of it. Just as it was natural for people to want warm water when they remove their hand, I believe it's natural, it's instinctual within each of you to want to achieve post-traumatic growth, to relieve yourself of that pain and that trauma. And the way you do that is through sense-making. It's through benefit finding. Next idea I want to talk about is self-transcendence. Now, self-transcendence derives from a very famous psychologist, Maslow. And Maslow, before he died, he placed self-transcendence at the very top of his hierarchy of needs theory. Now, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for those who don't know, is simply a culmination of things that he believes all human beings need in order to thrive and survive in life. So, at the bottom, you have your basics: food, water, shelter. And as you work your way up, that's where Maslow places self-transcendence, at the very top. Maslow describes self-transcendence as this idea of going beyond oneself. It's almost an enlightened state. You're seeing the world from a new lens, a new perspective, a new light. Ultimately, you realize that the world isn't for you, but for the greater good of all of humanity. That's what Maslow tries to get across in his idea of self-transcendence. I mentioned earlier that I delivered the eulogies for both my parents. I'm confident that I would be nowhere near the person that I am today if I didn't have to go through the reflection process necessary to memorialize these two beautiful souls in my life. I've since gained such a better sense for gratefulness and appreciation for the relationships, the connections, the bonds, the time that I have with those around me. You truly have to be able to twist your perspective and see things in this new light that we've talked about. And when you do that, when you take your devastation and you replace it with optimism, you take your sorrow and you replace that with deliberation. You have to take your worry and replace that with joy. And when you do that, you become overwhelmingly aware of all the great things that await in life. It's only through post-traumatic growth and self-transcendence do you gain this understanding. You see, since my parents died, that's ultimately what I've gained from life. It's so much of a better sense of awareness for those around me, for myself, and for what I want to achieve in this world. And ultimately, I found that when you do these things, when you begin to see that difficulty is an opportunity to help and assist those around you, that's when I found that I had gained from my parents, not lost them. I had transcended. Ultimately, what I find most interesting above all else today is that I truly believe that post-traumatic growth is what causes self-transcendence. You see, the two are so interconnected, you almost can't have one without the other. And when you begin to see things in trauma from this new perspective that we've talked about, then ultimately you find yourself trapped. Yet I found it is one of, if not the best places to be trapped, because you're inside this endless wheel of success. Before I leave today, I encourage you all, make your difficulties a tool for later prosperity. And make your actions and your efforts be energized and fueled by helping those around you. Because it's at that moment, that instant, when post-traumatic growth begins to cause self-transcendence, and when self-transcendence makes you always searching for post-traumatic growth, it's at that moment when you are locked. You are locked in a destiny for extraordinary greatness. Thank you.